My name is Larissa. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a scrub cap with a pouch for hair that I'm wearing right now, from start to finish. You need to print out my sewing pattern, cut it out, then tape it. Now you're ready. To get your own copy of my sewing pattern, click on the link at the top of your video on the right. Now you're ready to start sewing. Always iron your fabric before you cut it. Fold your fabric at 19¼ inches. Use the ruler to check that your edges are aligned properly. If your fabric, like mine, is solid color, mark the wrong side of the fabric. Now take the side part of the pattern and align it with the fold in the fabric. Trace all around it. Make marks on the spots where you will reinforce the fabric with zigzag stitch. Then pin 2 layers of the fabric together. Now you need to cut out the side part of your scrub cap. Mark the places for the zigzag reinforcement on both sides of your side part. For the top part of your scrub cap, you need only 1 layer of fabric. Use ruler to make sure that your sewing pattern is aligned to the edge of the fabric. Your grid needs to be parallel to the edges of the ruler. Now trace all around the top part of your scrub cap pattern. I used pins to secure my sewing pattern to the fabric before I move it and add the pouch to the top part of the scrub cap. I trace all around both the sewing pattern for the top and the pouch. Now I am tracing around the guide for the elastic tape. I marked the wrong side of the fabric before I cut out the top side of my scrub cap. Use the sewing pattern to mark the line on the fabric where pouch connects with the top part, and mark the wrong side of your guide. It's time to prepare the top part for sewing. First, we are going to iron down those spots where zigzag reinforcement will go, and mark those lines where the pouch will connect with the top with a pin. We are going to do that on both sides. So just sprinkle a little bit, then iron it down, take a pin and mark it. To finish preparing the top part for sewing, I need to iron down seam allowance for the pouch. To prepare side part of the scrub cap for sewing, I am going to iron down the spots where zigzag stitch will go first. I'm flipping around the fabric so as to prevent my fingers from being burned if I keep working on the hot fabric. Now I flip it again, and I'm going to iron down the seam allowance for the tie on my side part. I fold the curvy part second time, the one where the zigzag stitch will go. Then I flip to the other side, iron down the seam allowance for the tie, and make second fold on the part which will be stitched by zigzag. Next, I iron down seam allowance on the short side of the tie. Then fold seam allowance for the long side of the tie and all the way down the bottom of my scrub cap. Once I'm at the end of the second tie, I fold the seam allowance in the opposite direction on the short side to the direction of fold of seam allowance on the long side. I interlock the seam allowances to create a very nice clean end of the tie. I do that on both sides, of course. After ends of both ties are interlocked, I am going to iron the fold down, and the width of the tie is about 1 inch. Iron your tie and the hem of the scrap cap all the way to the other side. Once you reach the second tie, make sure that ends are still interlocking and iron them down so they stay nice and clean. Use zigzag stitch to reinforce your ties. Find the left tie of your scrap cap and flip your work on the wrong side. Now start stitching with zigzag at the corner of your left tie. Make sure that you are helping your sewing machine mechanism because there's nothing really for it to grab at the corner. So do a couple of stitches manually. And make sure when you're stitching through the tie that your needle always hits fabric, never goes through the air. And do the same thing on the other side, on the second tie. When you reach the corner, just help your sewing machine. Make a couple of stitches manually, just like I did. When I finish stitching, I hide the ends of the thread between the layers of fabric. I use my needle to do that. Ends of the ties look nice and clean. Next, we are going to use zigzag stitch to reinforce both sides of the top part of your scrap cap. After we reinforce both sides of the top part of the scrap cap with zigzag stitch, we are going to fold our pouch in two, right side inside, and secure those folds with pins. Now I need to make a seam closing one side of the pouch. I start with the corner and use straight stitch. I go all the way to the edge of the pouch. Then I stop, turn my work around, switch to zigzag stitch, and finish reinforcing that seam. At the corner, I make a knot and clean the seam, cutting off the thread and also the excess fabric all along the zigzag stitch. Next step is to prepare the guide for elastic tape. To do that, I am going to iron down all seam allowances all around that piece of fabric that is going to be my elastic tape guide. Next step, I iron down the seam I just made on my pouch. Then I flip the work on the wrong side, take my elastic tape guide, put it wrong side down, align it with the pin on one side of the top of the scrap cap, and then I secure the rest of it, aligning it with the edge of the pouch. I use zigzag stitch to connect the elastic tape guide to the top side of my scrap cap. I remove pins as I go all the way down to the other side. Once I reach the other end of the elastic tape guide, I am going to switch from zigzag stitch to the straight stitch. Right at this moment, I am going to stop my work, change the settings, and go straight stitch along the edge of the guide without stitching through it. Now I'm going to turn again, switch to zigzag, and finish stitching all the way to the other end, making sure that my needle, when it goes along the edge of the pouch, goes through the fabric, not through the air. Once I reach the end of the guide, I'm going to stop again, switch to the straight stitch, and finish stitching, making sure that the end is open. To finish this seam and make it nice and clean, I'm going to tie a knot, and I'm going to hide the ends of the thread between the layers of fabric using a needle. Before I can sew the other side of the pouch together, I need to pin together the ends of the elastic tape guide. I start stitching with straight stitch at the corner. Then I go all the way to the place where my elastic tape guide ends, making sure that I don't stitch through it. I flip my work around, switch to zigzag stitch, and stitch all the way back to the corner. Once I finish stitching, I tie a knot and make sure that I cut off the excess fabric all the way along the zigzag stitch. If you're using a serger doing your work, then you absolutely don't need to do this step. Both ends of your elastic tape guide should be open like this. Fold the top part of your scrap cap in half, find the center of it, and mark it with a pin. Do the same thing with the side part. Find the center of it and mark it with a pin. Now put the two centers together, face to face, and start connecting with pins both of your parts, the top part and the side part. Put your pins about 1 inch apart, making sure that your edges of the fabric are aligned and there are no ripples. Once you reach the reinforced parts of the fabric, align them and put the last pin at the pouch edge. Do the same on the other side of the scrap cap and finish pinning at the edge of the pouch. Once you finished pinning together the top side of your scrap cap to the side part, start stitching them together using the straight stitch at the right side of the scrap cap. Go all the way around to the other side, removing pins as you go and helping your work using your fingers. Once you reach the last pin, stop, turn your work around, make straight stitch until you reach the place where the open edge is. Now change your settings to zigzag and go all the way around to the other side of the scrap cap. Once you reach the place where the reinforced edges start, switch back to the straight stitch and finish stitching at the edge of the pouch. At the end of this seam, I tie a knot and hide the ends of the thread between the layers of fabric using my needle. Now I cut the excess fabric all around the zigzag stitch. If you use serger, you don't need to do this step. You will need 6 inches of elastic tape. I put safety pins on both ends of the elastic tape and thread the elastic tape through the guide. Once I reach the opening on the other end of the elastic tape guide, I pull the pins out and sew the ends of the elastic tape together by hand. Now distribute the ripples of the fabric all around the edge of the pouch, so it's nice and even. I'm going to turn my pouch right side out and iron all along that last seam that I made, connecting the top part with the side part of my scrap cap. And my work will be finished. Nice and beautiful.